Hello and welcome back to the latest installment of the top 100 best albums of all time series, or my 100 favorite albums of all time. And now we're finally at the gates of the top 50. So now today it's going to be my number 50 to number 41, and we'll start with number 50. And I'm sure not many Leonard Cohen fans will have this as their favorite Leonard Cohen album, but for some reason my favorite Leonard Cohen album is Various Positions from the 80s, 1984. I think this is a bit of an underrated Leonard Cohen album. I think all the songs are wonderful. It opens with Dance Me to the End of Love, one of my all-time favorite Leonard Cohen songs. And the big track on this album is Hallelujah, which became even bigger years after that, for example, with the cover by Jeff Buckley, of course. But, I think Leonard Cohen's version is my favorite version of that song. And yeah, it's maybe a bit of an, if you're not a diehard Leonard Cohen fan, maybe a bit of an overlooked album, but it's a wonderful singer-songwriter album, and I think one of the best singer-songwriter albums from the 1980s. My number 49. Maybe also a bit underrated, especially by people who are not fans of this artist. The artist is Paul McCartney. The band is Wings, and this is Venus and Mars. And spoiler, I won't have Band on the Run later on in this series. So Band on the Run didn't even make my top 100, and this is the follow-up to Band on the Run, which at the time, and maybe even nowadays, most people, at least the average Joe people, think that this is inferior to Band on the Run, if they even nowadays know about the existence of this album. It was very successful at the time, not as successful as Band on the Run, of course. I think Band on the Run, as for many Paul McCartney fans, is a bit overplayed for me. Maybe I listen to it too often. Also, nowadays when he's touring, and nowadays I mean for the last, 35 years or something, he plays at least 3 or 4, maybe 5 of the 8 tracks from Band on the Run in every concert since 1990 basically. And very rarely he will play songs from this album. Letting Go is an exception. For the last 10 years I think he almost always played Letting Go, which is a great song, but not even remotely the best song on this album, which also works nicely as an album. It's a very loose concept, involving astrology and astronomy. I think he was a bit on the Dark Side of the Moon trip. Dark Side on the Moon came out like 2 years before this, so maybe when Dark Side of the Moon, which is a big album for Paul McCartney personally, when this came out, I think that must have been around the time when he sat down and wrote the songs for this album. It's a great mid-70s arena rock album, but with a touch of the Beatle magic. Fantastic songs for Paul McCartney. Number 48, which is the newest addition to my top 100, because I think I listened in its entirety for the first time to this album like maybe 3-4 months ago when I bought it. Finally I bought it, the Stranglers debut album masterpiece, Rattus Norvegicus. It's strange, this is by far the most popular and most well-regarded Stranglers album, but I had 5 other Stranglers albums plus a best-of for many years in my collection, but never got around to this album. This is very strange. I like the Stranglers, I love their Greatest Hits album, Greatest Hits album, but if I had to choose one album as their definitive album, I would go with the mainstream and say their debut album is the finest hour, one of the most energetic, maybe one of the most energetic rock albums of all time. I wanted to say one of the most energetic punk albums of all time, but it's also in general, it's one of the best punk albums of all time, but it's also one of the best pop rock albums of all time, full stop. You know, this is really, otherwise it wouldn't be in this list as my number 48. It's a fantastic 1977 punk spirit album, but you know, so much more than just a punk album. You know, they transcended the borders of what punk could be, even before 2 years even before the Clash did so with London Calling. This is more than a punk album. Those are fine musicians, but with this punk spirit, and yeah, it's beginning to end a fantastic ride. This very wild album by this wild band. Next album is one of the few ties. I said it often, I don't like ties in such videos, but sometimes I have ties because I can't decide on an album by the same artist, and I like them, you know, about the same, and it also would be kind of weird if one album by the artist would be like my number, what is it, 47, and the next would be 46, so it's a tie because I like them about the same, and they're both by Curtis Mayfield. But that's Curtis, the album just titled Curtis, his very early solo album after, you know, the Impressions, and then the classic blaxploitation soundtrack album Superfly. Both are funk soul masterpieces, both probably very influential in, you know, what would later would become hip hop. You know, much later, 4, 5, 6, 7 years later, the first roots of what would become hip hop started in New York, I guess. But he was very early on with some of those, with a kind of an aesthetic, you know, that street, that urban American street aesthetic, and then funky, very rhythmic music, and also like almost like rapping on some tracks, you know, and it's really like more talking than singing. But when he's singing, you know, he has this great falsetto voice also, and wonderful melodies, also wonderful arrangements, you know, strings, brass, all that stuff. Fantastic, 2 fantastic albums, and I couldn't decide which I prefer. Next album is my favorite Joni Mitchell album, Ladies of the Canyon. I think it's the second or third album. I always confuse it. I think Song to a Seagull was the first, and probably Clouds a second or third, and this, I think Clouds was the second and this was the third album, and Blue was the fourth album, so the first 4 albums are all classics. We already had Song to a Seagull in this series, and now it's time for my all-time favorite Joni Mitchell album. So there were 3 Joni Mitchell albums in the top 100 because Hey Chiro from a later phase of her career also did make the top 100, but this, you know, this is one of the best singer-songwriter albums of all time. You know, perfect songwriting, and very influential to lots of artists and lots of things that would come later. Next one is also, you know, talking about an influential album and a classic. This is one of those ultra classics, one of those also critics' darlings albums, but in some cases I agree with the critics, in many cases in fact, and this is one of those cases where I agree with them. It's David Bowie, and it's my number 1 favorite David Bowie album, so there won't be any more David Bowie albums in this series. You know, the closer we get to my number 1, you know, now we're in the top 50. You know, it's all those artists now are having the final appearance in this series. Joni Mitchell had her final appearance. Curtis Mayfield had Leonard Cohen. They all in this episode had their final appearance. All artists that had more than 1 album in my top 100, and now it's David Bowie's turn. Not very original to have this as your favorite David Bowie album. But, you know, usually there's a reason for, you know, some albums being hailed and being on like the Mount Rushmore of an artist's career. And, you know, what can you say about Ziggy Stardust? Perfect glam rock concept, rock opera kind of an album. And also great individual songs. You know, works as an album, but, you know, Starman, Suffragette City, the title track, 5 Years, you know, it's packed with fantastic songs. Next one is one, you know, now we had a critics' darling album, now the opposite, now an album that when it came out even got kind of ridiculed by the cool people and the critics. and to this day is an underdog album, even more so than Venus and Mars. London Town is an underdog album in Paul McCartney's career, also because Paul McCartney himself, seems to have a difficult relationship with the album, since it's one of the few albums without an archive edition treatment. He did all those archive editions to all his albums up to Flaming Pie, but this album and the next album in his career, Back to the Egg, they're the both big ones that he neglected, where he for some reason thought they're not worth to have a big deluxe edition. And like many fans, more the diehard hardcore fans, like many diehard fans, I disagree with Paul McCartney's assessment and also the assessment of the critics at the time. Also he got this new documentary out at the moment, Man on the Run, and I don't think it's even mentioned in the documentary, which focuses on Wings and the 70s, so that tells you all about the status of this album. But I and many other Paul McCartney and Wings fans love this album. It's one of his more eccentric albums, very whimsical. If you're really that kind of Paul McCartney fans who also maybe even especially likes all the attributes he gets ridiculed for by like John Lennon fans or like hard rock fans, it's all there. It's a very soft, not really schmaltzy, but very sentimentally sounding album in places. So it's if you don't like Paul McCartney, you really won't like this album. It's not an album to convince someone to become a Paul McCartney fan, but once you're a Paul McCartney fan, this embodies all you love about the man. And his band Wings, which for the most part of the recordings of this album was like the same trio as Band on the Run, Paul, Linda, Danny, although Jimmy McCulloch and Joe English also appear on some songs, like with Band on the Run, where the lead guitar, where Danny Saville and Henry McCulloch left the band before they even started recording. With London Town, they left the band in the middle of the sessions, so they're on some tracks. Number 43 now is again a classic, so from an underdog to a classic again. This time it's the only, in this case it's the only album in my top 100 by Carole King. It's the undisputed masterpiece Tapestry, also one of the biggest selling albums of the 70s. So this is a case where an album is commercially and artistically like a fantastic milestone. Recently I got into her other albums. I really love many of her other albums, especially 70s albums. Some of her albums almost made it into the top 100, but didn't make it in the end. But she's more than just this album. But this is the big one. But several other albums, at least 4 or 5 other albums of hers, I also would consider masterpieces. Next is number 42, my favorite John Lennon solo album, and I think the only John Lennon album, if you discount Beatles albums, in the top 100, and we hadn't yet a Beatle album. I think we still haven't had any Beatle album at this point, number 42. My favorite John Lennon album, Imagine. I think that's the finest moment of his short solo career. It's also his most pop solo album. I mean, Double Fantasy is also very pop, but it's only half an album, half a John Lennon album, because the other half of the tracks is Yoko, so it can't be as big as Imagine for me because of that, because if you count it as a John Lennon album, it's just a mini album. Plus the songs on Imagine, I think, have more substance and, are better than most of the tracks on Double Fantasy, which is also a good album, in my opinion. And the last one for today, 41, Prince. I don't think this is going to be my number 1 favorite Prince album, but it's my number 41, so it's one that I rank very highly and I really like a lot. It's Around the World in a Day, the 1985, I think, follow-up to Purple Rain. And it's all, if you like Purple Rain, you will also like this album. But this album, maybe offers even a bit more than Purple Rain, because it's more eclectic. This is more this sounds more adventurous and more fun in a way. He's experimenting with psychedelic, with 60s psychedelia on this album, and incorporates it into his own unique Prince style. And I think this is probably the only album in his catalog that does that sounds like that. Maybe Parade also to a certain extent, but this is, there's only this album, and the color, the album sounds a bit like the album looks, very colorful, very bright, also very, out there in a way. But it also has big hit songs like Raspberry Beret, which is one of my favorite Prince songs. So that was number 50 to number 41. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time, goodbye.